we'll have a specific focus today on the science research within the programme, and we'll be telling you a bit about the data we're gathering and what we're going to do with those data. Each of our webinars is recorded and available on YouTube channel, so this one will be available probably from next week. So I encourage you to watch back the past webinars that we've had to find out a bit more about the programme. If you have any questions as we go along, you can put them in the Q&A chat and we'll aim to answer them as we go along. So the Nature Park is a partnership programme, and presenting today are three of us from the lead organisation, the Natural History Museum. I'm Lucy Robinson, I'm Deputy Head of the Museum's Centre for UK Nature, and I lead our community science programme. We use the phrase community science to mean the same as citizen science. Presenting with me today are Dr. Jade Gunnell, who's the Community Science Officer on this project, and Dr. Victoria Burton, who's a postdoc researcher within our programme team. As you can see, we're a big partnership, and I'm sure you'll recognise some of those organisations that are listed here. And we're funded by the Department for Education to run this National Education Nature Park programme until 2027. I'm going to start off with a few slides to introduce the programme as a whole in case it's new to you, and then Jade and Victoria will tell you a little bit more about the science research and the data and the digital tools that we're using. So the overall goal of the Nature Park is to empower every young person in England to connect with nature and to learn about nature, and really importantly, to take action within their school space to make a positive difference. I don't really need to tell you all the background to this. We all know that we are in a planetary emergency, and this project addresses this from multiple angles and multiple perspectives. So practically taking action towards nature recovery and enhancing spaces to make them greener and more biodiverse. Scientifically, we're studying that process to better understand the most effective ways that we can achieve nature recovery, especially in heavily used or really urban sites, like schools tend to be, and also through education, which has been recognised as a key part of this puzzle, and the associated green skills and learning and nature connectedness that goes along with that. An international learning research project that I co-led a few years ago studied young people as they took part in community science and citizen science, and showed that through that participation, it really supports young people's science learning, and particularly their development of a sense of agency, that they can act and that they can have a role in improving the environment. So we're really looking forward to making the science research visible within this programme, because it's really important to achieving those impacts. The programme as a whole has 5 aims, and as you can see on the left, one of those is to achieve biodiversity gain across the educational estate. And the area that all these schools and nurseries and colleges are on adds up to a huge area collectively. So we're looking to make lots of small changes across many, many sites to have a really big impact. So the programme isn't just about education, although it's focused on schools, but it's about achieving real-world change. And today we're going to talk a bit more about how we intend to achieve those changes and that improvement, and specifically how we're going to evidence these biodiversity gains. A little bit about the programme structure. It's England only because education is devolved, and it spans right from nurseries through primary and secondary schools up to colleges. So we have a really big age range of young people that we're working with. And it's really, really important to us that this programme isn't just for schools that have a lot of green space or are on a big site. So we're working really hard to make it relevant, no matter how grey or green your starting point is. We have regional teams across England who are liaising with schools, with local authorities, multi-academy trusts and others who can really support the programme rollout at scale. We have around 10% of all schools in England signed up so far, so that's really amazing take up in our first year. The RHS is administering a grant scheme for selected schools to support them to actually make changes to their site. And we're one of a number of initiatives funded by the Department for Education. So we're working across in partnership with a number of different schemes so that schools are getting consistent messaging and so that we're not competing. And it's really important to us, and especially thinking about the organisations that you all are representing today, we don't want to compete with existing initiatives and existing schemes. So we're really looking at how we can build on existing things and integrate with existing initiatives to have greater impact. So what does the programme look like if you're a nursery or a school or college taking part? We have this 5-step cycle, and we hope that schools will move it round and round it in a kind of cyclical fashion. So it starts with getting to know your space and understanding your starting point. So we'll talk in a few minutes about the baseline surveys that we're running to understand the starting point from which to measure change. And also there's lots of engagement activities for young people to just feel comfortable outside and to connect with their space and to see it through different eyes, to think about it as a resource for wildlife. So young people will be developing a vision for their site, planning the enhancements that they'll make, guided by our advice, and then make change happen on their site. And a suite of surveys will then allow them to measure and monitor the impact of the changes that they've had. And then they continue round in this cycle as they make iterative improvements. Community science or citizen science is the key mechanism for gathering data to evidence this impact and to try and understand these biodiversity gains or biodiversity change over time. So we're developing surveys that are focused on different habitats or taxa or functional groups, and obviously we're tailoring to the different age groups that we're working with. As I said, where possible, we want to align with or feed data into existing schemes. So an example of that is our first survey, which is a slight adaptation of the pollinator monitoring scheme's fit counts. And we've carefully designed it so that some of the data that young people will be gathering will feed into the national scheme. Amongst our partners is the NBNT Trust, so they're supporting us with ensuring that relevant data get shared and flow through normal biological recording and verification processes where it's relevant and appropriate to. And we're conducting our own data quality assessments as well to quantify the accuracy of the data that young people are gathering. We know, obviously, amongst the age range we're working with, young children in a nursery are not gathering robust scientific data, but certainly older children are. And so we're taking a kind of responsive approach to that. We don't want to reinvent new tools and create new things. And so we're reusing and adapting existing digital tools. Esri, who develop ArcGIS software, are the partner who are developing a lot of the digital tools and the database that's storing the data. And we're also using iNaturalist. We're making the most of the verification within iNaturalist to quality assure data before it then flows into iRecord. It's important to say that all the data that the schools gather are CC0 licensed, so they will be fully accessible for anyone to use for any purpose. So that sets the scene a little bit for the programme as a whole. So I'll hand over now to Jade Gunnell, who's going to introduce some of these digital tools that we're using, in particular the ones that we're developing with Esri, and some of the data types that we're actually gathering through the programme, so you get a flavour of what data we'll be building and what kind of evidence we'll be gathering over time. So I'll hand over to Jade.
Thanks, Lucy. So I'm going to talk you through, as Lucy said, the digital tools that we've been developing and the different types of data collection methods we're using to help learners and educators understand their site and monitor their impact over time, but also support the national research that we're doing on biodiversity gain in semi-urban spaces. So we developed a suite of free tools working very, very closely with Esri UK. And these are what support kind of 5 kind of sets of activities that we are asking educators and learners to do through the community science in the programme. So the first thing is that they define their site boundary. So educators go into the nature park map and draw a polygon around the perimeter of their educational setting site. They then move into identifying and mapping the existing habitats that they have on their site. The educators work with learners to identify the habitats, and then the educators will actually do the mapping part of the process. Then we go into the kind of biodiversity data collection phase, which happens before they make any change, but also continuously after they've made any changes. So this is biological records and structured community science surveys. And then finally, educators can also record any changes that the learners make on their sites so that we can piece together that ongoing long-term monitoring of biodiversity data with kind of habitat and land cover use change data as well. Next slide, please. And so the first task is defining site boundaries. It's one of the first things we ask educators to do once they've registered in the programme. And what they do is they go into the mapping tool, draw their polygon onto the map, and then they add in their unique reference number that's provided by the government. And this auto-populates their settings name, address, and the phase of education. And we're doing this so that from this point forward, that's the foundation for all the data they collect subsequently. So any data that they put onto the map that's within that polygon is then associated with their URN. And that means we can manage and understand their engagement, but also make sure that they can access their data set and be presented with it in lots of different ways further down the line. We are manually verifying every single site boundary because this is the foundation of the data set, so we want it to be as accurate as possible. And we're accepting a 10-metre error on where those lines sit on the map, so that this is, as we understand it, is in line with what professional data sets are managing in terms of GIS accuracy. Next slide, please. Once they've done their site boundary, they move into their mapping and identifying of habitats. And we've produced a list of habitats, which we've adapted from the UK Habitats Classification and the Urban Greening Factor Classification. So we had a look at these classifications and identified which types of habitats would we reasonably expect to find on educational setting sites, considering both the smallest of nurseries with tiny outdoor spaces, if any outdoor space at all the way through to large private schools that have significant amounts of land. And we produced a list of 29 habitat and land cover areas, which include things like mixed woodland, food growing areas, non-natural impermeable surfaces, and 16 linear habitats with things such as hedges, climbing plants and streams. And we consulted heavily with other colleagues, external colleagues who work in science, to make sure that we felt these were appropriate. And all of those categories can be mapped directly back to UK HABs and Urban Greening Factor and their definitions. And this was important for us because we want to make sure, as far as possible, the learners' data that they can collect can be used and is comparable to the data sets that are produced in the professional world, so that with all the data being open access, other researchers outside of the nature park could draw on this data and use it. We also produced a list of 16 what we call microhabitat points, and these are the types of features you'd expect in domestic wildlife gardens or in school settings, the kind of relatively easy access ways that people can put a little intervention in for nature, like a bird box or a compost bin. Next slide, please. So we've developed a suite of resources that help the learners to identify their habitats, and the identification is very much learner-led. So in the bottom right-hand corner, there's an example of some of the scaffolding activities we've developed that help introduce the concepts and features that the young people need to understand in order to identify the habitats. And in some cases, these are like miniature, relatively light touch surveys to help them understand different types of, in this case, grassland, how many grasses are there compared to wildflowers in a given space. And then once they've built those foundational concepts, they can move to the flowcharts, which are displayed on the left, and answer a series of yes or no questions to find their way to a habitat identification, which the educator will then put map into their Esri tool. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the kind of thing that schools are achieving. So this is from the Co-op Academy in Manchester. It was one of the first settings to have completed their habitat map. We've got about 150 settings so far, have done some, if not all, of their map, and we are absolutely thrilled to bits with the results. They are certainly more detailed, more careful, and much richer than we might have expected, considering that this has never really been done with young people before, and some of the concepts can be quite challenging. So we're really, really thrilled with the quality and richness of the data sets that are coming through so far, and we'll be looking to start validating some of this data going forwards. Then once the habitat mapping is in place, we want our learners and educators to understand what biodiversity they've already got on their sites before they start making changes. And those same processes they use to do that, they can then repeat continuously after making changes to see how things change over time and get an understanding of their impact. So the first way that they can do this is by signing up to iNaturalist UK. We encourage the educators to set up an account and put NENP in their username. And then they can take the young people out into their grounds with digital tools or cameras and go and just explore and find whatever types of organisms they can, get those onto the iNaturalist UK website and wait for the verifications and identifications to come through from the naturalist community. And what's really valuable about using iNaturalist is, one, this is a much more kind of casual way of going out and collecting biological records. So it gives really great amount of freedom for the educators to get the kids out and collect scientific data. You know, an educator can say, right, we've got 10 minutes spare this afternoon, let's get out and let's do some, collect some images. Or they might decide to do a structured session over 30 minutes attached to some curriculum linked activities, to have something that's a little bit more robust and packaged up as a more rigorous learning activity. What's also really valuable, and we've got anecdotal evidence of this, is young people then get to become aware of and engage with the biological recording community, seeing those identifications and verifications coming through. And we've heard that the young people find it really enjoyable to see, particularly when their teachers have been proven to get their IDs wrong and someone's corrected them. Next slide, please. And then we've developed a wildlife observations map where they can then go and see their data within the nature park context. So they visit this website and all of the data in iNaturalist that's got NENP in the username gets pulled through to this map. So they can find their location on the map and click on the iNaturalist icons to understand, well, to have a look at the biological record, basically. So what's the species name, common name, where was it found? And from here on the bottom right-hand corner, they can also click back straight to iNaturalist UK to get more information about who verified their record, did everyone agree with the identification, and get to understand more about this process of how we identify biological records in the community. Next slide, please. And then in June this year, so actually just 4 weeks ago, we launched our first structured biodiversity survey. This is the first of several that we're intending to develop and launch. And as Lucy mentioned before, this so we've called this the pollinator count, but it's adapted directly from the pollinator monitoring scheme's FIT count. So it's a fixed time count where the young people observe a specific type of flower for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, which I'll talk about in a second, and they record how many insects they see and assign those to 10 different groups of insects, which are on the table on the bottom right-hand corner. Now, this survey, in terms of the questions that we get them to answer, is essentially the same as the mainstream FIT count survey. And we're getting them to do the same time period in most instances, which is 10 minutes. And our intention, again, is that we want the learners' data to be valuable to the broader scientific community and used in other research outside of the nature park, and really give the learners a sense that they're contributing to something even bigger than the scale of what the nature park is. But we also recognise that educators need some flexibility. So we've also offered a 5-minute version for educators who feel their learners won't be able to sit for 10 minutes and observe insects. And that data will still be used in the nature park, but not pushed through to the FIT count programme. We've developed an app with Esri so that this can be done digitally and the data submitted immediately after data collection. But we know a lot of educators and schools don't have access to digital tools or reliable internet. So we've also got a printed version of the form as well. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, with the habitat mapping data they've collected and the biodiversity data they've collected, our learners and educators are learning new things about their sites, and they're using this information to then make decisions about what changes they want to make to their site and where. And we've just, in the last couple of days, launched our mapping change tool, which is where educators can record on their habitat map the changes and enhancements they've made. This includes both the things they've made to boost biodiversity as part of the nature park, but also any other changes that might happen on the school site, such as a building extension, which reduces the amount of outdoor space and things like that. They can also record which parts of the process the learners have engaged in when a certain intervention has been put in place. And this is really important for us understanding to what extent our learners are engaging in this process and to what extent it's led by them. And next slide, please. And so finally from me, this tool, the mapping change tool, is also a really key way that our learners and educators are able to explore their data. So they can, with this slider that's represented on the screen, the line down the middle, they can slide it left to right, and on the left-hand side is their original baseline map, and on the right-hand side are the enhancements that they've made, highlighted in bright colours. They can also use a timeline tool to see how their changes that they've made have accumulated over time. And then we've also got a layers function, which will build as we add more biodiversity surveys to the programme. But at present, this is a place where they can overlay a map of where they've done their quadrats for their pollinator count surveys on top of the map to understand where their data is coming from in relation to the habitats they have on their site. And I'll pass over to Victoria.
Hello everyone. So I'm Victoria. I'm one of the two postdoctoral researchers on the Nature Park project, and the core question that I need to be answering on the project is actually evidencing the biodiversity gain on the project. So actually the question, are these changes the schools make to their site actually making a difference to wildlife? But actually it's kind of also the kind of change in the site, because realistically, you know, some of the gains might not be able to see within the timeline of the project, but there's also lots of other questions that we'll be able to answer from the nature project. This, you know, the scale of it makes it a really exciting project for scientists to be able to answer all sorts of different questions. And one of the key ones of that is exactly what habitats and wildlife are there across the schools estate, because it's one of the most under-researched land uses in England. So all this is brand new data collected by all the learners, and because you know, lots of new information that I'll be able to look at, and I'm excited to be able to see lots of other things about that information, like how is it influenced by the geography, the type of school, and the surrounding landscape. And there's also loads of scope for sub-projects, and for example, in the pollinator count, which recently launched. On the next slide, there's lots of research questions I've developed around that, such as kind of the really obvious ones like how are pollinators doing across the nature park, but also ones like how that varies across the country, and things like what are the best plants and habitats and changes that make to increase pollinators across the nature park. So all that can feed back into the different advice we can give to the schools. And I'm also really keen to support the schools in helping to answer some of the questions on their own site, so feeding into that curriculum links within science and testing hypotheses and building their own projects, especially in those taking science and GCSE and A levels, for example, making their own projects around testing, you know, how many more pollinators there are affected by temperature or flower colour, for example. So on the next slide, we have some of the techniques that I'll be using for examining the what existing biodiversity is on the site. And one of the nice things about this is that I don't have to wait until some of that biodiversity data is in from iNaturalist and the pollinator count and the other wildlife ones we're developing. I can use that data that's being collected on habitat area and existing estimates from within the literature and do some computer modelling, and can also use that to estimate potential gains if changes are made. For example, if they want to convert playing fields into species-rich land grass, and what potentially can we gain in terms of biodiversity. And on the next slide, see my fellow postdoc, Dr. Alexa Vara, is supporting this by conducting meta-analysis. So that's finding lots of studies within the literature and combining them to find out what are the biodiversity gains associated with doing small-scale habitat enhancements that the schools are putting in. And that will also inform the advice we're giving to education settings, but again, help predict some of these longer-term gains, especially in those cases where these might be longer than the project term, such as things like woodlands, where we might be planting trees, but we might not see those gains in biodiversity decades into the future. But by using these modelling techniques, we can get a kind of estimate of what that might be later on, and also hopefully test that later on. And on the next slide. So in addition to the pollinator count, we're also planning future biodiversity surveys. Similar to the pollinator count, these are going to be based on kind of functional groups, so not so much at the species level. They're all going to be designed for repeated ongoing monitoring across the main nature habitats, and based on existing protocols if possible. We don't want to compete with existing ones. We want to be compatible as much as possible with existing ones, and where possible contribute to existing efforts. But yeah, how are we actually going to use that data to measure biodiversity change within the nature park? Well, the obvious answer would be to measure before and after, and this is one of the methods we'll be using, but this actually has some disadvantages unless we also do a control site alongside of that, because of course in insects in particular, their populations can vary from year to year due to the weather, and it can be difficult to tell if those changes are due to the kind of improvements you've made, or if there's actually some other reason, such as the weather, for example. So another method we'll be using is the control versus intervention, also known as space for time. So you compare your intervention site with another site which was similar to the site before you made the intervention. So you actually record them at the same time, and then I'll be comparing the data then, which has the advantage of you remove some of the variation, and also you can do it at the same time, and that has the advantage from the educator's point of view that they can do that with their pupils, and they can compare, and they have that nice comparison that's very useful for the curriculum, and they get the data straight away in that 1 year. But it is a proxy for change. So realising that, we need a very flexible approach across the nature park with its great variety of sites, I'll probably be using a combination of these methods. So now I'm going to pass back to Lucy, who's going to tell you some of the things that's coming up in the nature park over the next year.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, it's important to say that we are only 9 months or so since launching. We only launched in October last year, so it's still relatively early days in terms of us developing resources and undertaking the scientific research. So later this year, we'll be publishing an end of year 1 report, sharing our achievements so far in the programme. That should be out around October time. And we're also holding a couple of workshops this summer. So as we're thinking ahead to our next guidance we want to give out to schools on enhancing their site, and the next biodiversity surveys that we want to do, we're looking to hold some workshops on grasslands and ponds, which are going to be our 2 next kind of focal areas, to bring expertise together and make sure that the advice we're giving to schools is the best possible advice based on the latest evidence. So in the link that I posted in the chat at the beginning of the webinar, and I'll share it again in a moment, there's an expression of interest form. And if you'd like to come to one of these workshops, then please fill in that form. We're hoping to launch our second biodiversity survey in the spring, which is likely to be on grasslands. And we're also developing further surveys each year. So if you don't see your taxonomic group or your specialist area coming up yet, we want to pace the programme so that teachers are kind of guided through it, focusing on different parts of their site kind of systematically, and so that they're not overwhelmed with here's all the wildlife surveys you could do all at once. So I'd ask you to bear with us as we kind of pace teachers and pace ourselves through the programme and turn our attention to different habitats and different taxa as we go along. Longer term, we're also exploring other ways of monitoring sites, including using sensors, and our partners at UKCEH will be looking at that in the coming years, although that's a little bit further down the line. So how can you and your organisation engage? I'll put the link again in the chat for you. There's these workshops coming up. Sorry, I'm just posting the link again. There's workshops coming up where you can express an interest using the form. As I say, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we would love to hear about monitoring schemes, surveys that you have, resources perhaps you have that you think might be suitable for schools or that could be adapted for a school audience. So we'd really love to build on what's already in existence and not compete. As Victoria mentioned, there's lots of scope for spin-off research projects or little sort of sub-research projects within the bigger programme. It's still early days, so we haven't quite worked out how we'll implement that, but I think we're excited to make the most of this amazing kind of research infrastructure that we actually have of lots and lots of sites who are interested in doing these surveys. So we'll be exploring that in future. And so if you have a particular research question that you think might align, we'd love to hear about that. And of course, all of you as possibly as parents or grandparents, or maybe you're involved in your local school, we'd really love you to tell your school or family or friends about this and encourage participation, because it is something that we really want to encourage as many schools as possible to sign up to. So here's the link and also a QR code that will take you to that expression of interest. I'll close by thanking you all for making the time to join today. We appreciate you're all very busy, so we really appreciate your interest in the Nature Park programme, and we'll continue to share updates like this as the programme goes on, and we hope to be working with lots of you as the programme rolls out in future years. So thanks for your time again. Have a great afternoon.